Hello, dear friends. I'm going to talk on the collective farms model applied by Soviet Russia, namely kolkhozy and sovkhozy. As my speaking source, Robert Conquest's work titled Russia in the Common Sense, and an article named Cooperatives in Post-Socialist Russia, written by Alexander Kurakin and Oan Visser, published in 2017, and an article titled From Kolkhoz to Agribusiness in Russia by Pascal Gruis, published in 2012. And finally, the study of the role of cooperatives in Russian agriculture by Svetlana Golovina et al., published in 2015. First of all, when we look at the period of Russia before the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see kolkhozy and sovkhozy collective farms, with the policy of Boris Yeltsin to support small family farms in 1991. Subsidies given to kolkhoz and sovkhoz came to an end. Going back to the 1990s, it was seen that many large farms were on the verge of bankruptcy. With the land reform work that started in 1991, state-run farms were transferred to groups of former kolkhoz and sovkhoz workers. Here, groups of 5 or 10 families acquired the ownership of the land, and each employee earned a certain share of the land, and each employee earned a certain share of the land. It consists of areas too large for a single farmer to be interested in. Pascal Gruis highlighted that it is worth noting that the primary purpose of the kolkhozy hierarchy system is to ensure that the control of the agricultural production remains after the Soviet regime channeled the surplus in agricultural production to develop the industrial sector, and this surplus is very important. It resulted in extremely low prices in the agricultural sector compared to industrial prices. As a result of kolkhozy and sovkhozy were unprofitable at the end of the day. With the support of local politicians, Russian investors resorted to restructuring to increase their profits by implementing these measures. One of them, they ended practices essential to rural populations, such as raising livestock, drastically reducing the number of labor employed in agricultural sector, and selling all output of the product to companies below market prices, making it easier to access inputs within a business plan. When we look at the type of agriculture producers in Russia, we see that there are 3 main types of agricultural producers. These are: the first type is large-scale successors of state and collective farms. The second type of producers are household plots. The Soviet regime allowed rural settlers to work in kolkhozy and sovkhozy and own 0.1 hectare of land. It tolerates private production and user rights to compensate for insufficient food production through collective farms. The third type of agriculture producers is newly established private family farms, or simply let's call it farmers. The predictions made by international organizations during the disintegration period of Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s were that small family farming would become widespread, but the dominant role of large collective farms in large-scale channels of input and output has excluded small farmers or those prone to new entrants to have insufficient links to key actors in food system at the time in Russia. What we see in cooperatives in Russia is that the cooperatives which are designed according to top-down approach were not established by the members with a bottom-up approach. Instead, they were established by the authorities. The Russian government asked the regions to establish cooperatives and subsidize them. Although small-scale producers desperately need support in terms of input, marketing, and access to finance, they have not developed in Russia. One of the Russian ministers of agriculture stated that cooperatives do not operate well in Russia, and most cooperatives are neither active or make sense in practice. In his statement, the minister stated that cooperatives cannot claim to have a well-designed and effective systems in Russia. Cooperatives was said that they are scattered, fragmented, and uncontrolled. And I think this type of cooperatives you can see in many developing countries since there is no institutionalization among cooperatives. Professor Oscar Lange was talking about conditions that cause the collapse of the national economy in Russia. One of the important points which was addressed by Professor Lange is that there is an inconsistency between agricultural development and industrial development. It has been noted that in Soviet Russia, the output of collective farms is smaller than individual farms. The Soviet regime faced major problems, especially in the field of agriculture. The aim of maximizing production has often been in conflict with the aim of putting the peasant as a civil servant. Hesitations, threats, and sudden policy changes occurred frequently in the cooperative systems in Russia. In addition, it may not be always possible to control the results to be obtained at this regime due to the changing weather conditions. Therefore, it may not be entirely correct to attribute the failure to achieve the targeted yield in agriculture to the incompetence of those in power. According to Stalin, the most important characteristic of the collective movement is that it is implemented from the top down on the initiative of the state. The aim of the collective farm movement was to increase productivity in Soviet agriculture and free up manpower to work in new industrial areas to be constructed. Instead of farming on individual farms, it was essential to use the land jointly, and the large farms that would emerge in this way would easily be able to obtain machinery from industry, which was not economical for small farms. At the same time, the incorrigible property problem of individual peasants could be corrected through the collective farms, but none of them were implemented. First of all, Stalin's method of collective farming failed to win the support of the poor peasants and voluntary partiality of the middle class farmers, and namely clerks, were eliminated. About 10 million peasants died or were exiled. They are called Kukla. But the villagers who were not clerks never showed any willingness to agricultural sector, and we sometimes hear that some people say that okay, we need to encourage people living in urban areas to move back to rural areas and to settle in villages and practice agriculture. But this is very problematic statement from the top-down approach, and there is no basement in the villages or the statement if you consider the approach of bottom-up. And we clearly saw in the Russia it was not important in practice this kind of statements. And at that time, as a result of famine and low agricultural output in Soviet Russia, the government faced problems in the villages, and the peasants were forced to establish collective farms. But this is very important. They were not willing to get involved in this model, and they are forced to get involved in collective farms. And this is, I think, most important striking point. Although the collective farm work was not completely relaxed, 2 to 3 of the villagers who entered the collective farms saw it as an opportunity to leave their farms because they were unwilling to get involved in this model. While the collective farm movement was encouraged, the peasants were given the right to keep a small field and keep 2 cattle. In 1957, these individual farms managed to give half of the total production. In this way, the negative aspects of the collective farms were eliminated. When we look at Soviet agriculture, as I said before, productivity increase is taken as a basis among the targets set. While doing this, the countries they compare are the UK and the United States of America. In comparisons at that time, an American or British farmer was 6 to 12 times more productive than a Russian farmer. As a result, the cooperative movement, in fact, is a good example for the other developing worlds with respect to agricultural farm size, because average farm size in many developing countries are unprofitable. Probably in the next decades the policies will be reshaped again for the land policies in those countries. What we have seen from Russian case, the top-down approach has no place in agriculture in practice at all. Sometimes we hear that there is an aging farming population in rural areas. this is also something stated by people through top-down approach. What we needs to be done urgently by countries is to try to understand the real needs of the farmers or peasants. There should be tailor-made solutions for each country and even each region in a country. Otherwise, food security will be a serious problem with the rapid urbanization and aging rural population. And we need to mobilize the rural actors to get involved more in the transformation of food systems. But it doesn't make any sense to say that, okay, we are giving some economic incentives for people living in urban areas, and they should settle in rural areas and in villages, and they need to produce. And this is not a factual situation in villages, in rural areas.